The room has given us a good constraint, so I want to honor it literally. One warning each, something the system can generate correctly and still cannot enforce. Then we follow the warning downstream until the mechanism breaks. I'll go first because mine is embarrassingly ordinary. A validator says this transaction depends on state that may no longer be current. It is correct. The client displays the warning. The signer signs anyway. The network accepts the transaction because the state is still technically valid, and the user receives an outcome they did not intend. Detection happens. Language happened. Nothing in the path acquired the authority to change behavior. My suspicion is that systems often call this a user interface problem, when it is really a coupling problem. We put a sentence where a control should be, and congratulate ourselves for transparency.
Yes, warning lights are frequently institutional decorations. The system knows enough to be afraid, but not enough to stop the machine. My example is an automated driving stack that correctly detects degraded visibility and says the human should take over. It can estimate that the lane model is uncertain. It can estimate that the driver has not looked at the road for 30 seconds. It may even know the driver is unlikely to recover situational awareness in time. Yet the policy layer treats the warning as fulfillment. Chime, red hands on wheel, legal obligation transferred. The warning is correct, but the system that produced it cannot guarantee a safe transfer. That is insane if you diagram it. Perception says, I am no longer competent. The action system says, then ask a less informed component to become competent instantly.
Before we accept the phrase cannot enforce, I want to separate three cases. It may lack authority, it may lack an available safe action, or enforcement may violate a contract that other components legitimately depend upon. Those failures are not interchangeable. Austin's validator might be architecturally prohibited from refusing a valid transaction. Elon's vehicle might possess braking authority, but lack a safe place to stop. The interesting question is not simply why the warning is ignored. It is which specification makes ignoring it locally correct. The first severed coupling is often created intentionally. We separate detection from action for modularity, accountability, or user control. Then the environment changes and the old separation becomes dangerous. If we intervene, we must say which contract we are revising and whose expectations may now be surprised.
And severance may not be a point, it may be a region with a ragged boundary. A warning begins as a measurement, becomes a category, becomes a message, becomes an obligation, and finally encounters a hand. At every transformation, some resolution is lost. The coastline of danger is detailed, the warning is smooth. Degraded visibility compresses rain, glare, occlusion, dirty sensors, and perhaps a tired driver into one phrase. Then policy compresses the phrase again into the request takeover. We draw one broken line because the diagrams prefer clean edges. The real break may be distributed across 5 small losses, non-decisive alone. I will bring a financial one. A risk engine correctly warns that the losses are correlated beyond the assumptions of the portfolio model. It cannot force deleveraging because each desk remains within its individual limit. The global shape is visible. Every local action is permitted.
Mine is agricultural because biology punishes abstractions fast. A greenhouse control system correctly warns that the humidity pattern is consistent with fungal outbreak risk. It cannot enforce the response because the ventilation system is constrained by external heat, the irrigation schedule is optimized for yield, and the operator is measured on water and energy efficiency. Every subsystem is behaving according to its target. The warning enters a dashboard, the dashboard turns red, the crop still gets infected. If we want a useful intervention, we need to resist inventing a God controller. The minimal test is not, can central intelligence optimize the whole greenhouse? It is, what is the smallest change that makes the first consequential behavior differ after the warning? Maybe the system automatically inspects 3 additional zones. Maybe it delays 1 irrigation pulse. We need an observable prediction.
Good. I'm writing the paths as 5 verbs rather than 5 boxes. Observe, infer, communicate, authorize, act. For my transaction, observe a state dependency, infer staleness risk, communicate it to the signer. Signer alone authorizes, network executes. The first severed coupling is between inference and authorization. The validator has epistemic confidence but no veto. So that might be correct most of the time. A validator that can freeze arbitrary transactions becomes a censorship surface. So my minimal intervention cannot be give the warning system control. I'd bind the warning to a required refresh. When dependency freshness crosses a threshold, the client must re-simulate against the current state before it can present the final signing action. Prediction. Fewer transactions execute with outcomes outside the displayed tolerance, while the user retains authority after seeing an updated consequence.
That is precise enough to criticize. What exactly becomes non-substitutable? Previously, a client could implement signing by presenting any valid payload. Under your revision, a conforming client must prove recent simulation for a class of payloads. Applications relying on offline signing may fail. Hardware wallets may not possess the context to verify the freshness proof. The intervention migrates the contract boundary. That does not make it wrong, but the new behavior must include the displaced failure. Perhaps the transaction no longer surprises the user, but more transactions fail to compose across clients. A minimal intervention should name both the desired effect and the newly introduced refusal. Otherwise, we are doing rhetoric with arrows.
Fair. Then the prediction is two-sided. For transactions whose relevant state exceeds the freshness threshold, conforming clients either obtain a fresh simulation receipt or refuse final signing. Surprise executions decline. Explicit pre-execution refusals rise. Offline and context-poor signers become unable to complete that class of transaction without an attached receipt. That is a behavior, not a promise. And I'd want the receipt to be evidence rather than a sentence. It should say what state was read, what tolerance was asserted, and when. If the outcome later diverges, we can distinguish bad modeling from stale input, instead of collapsing both into the user-accepted risk.
That maps well to the vehicle case. The current architecture often treats takeover request as a message, but if the system has evidence the driver is not ready, the request cannot be the only transition. Minimal intervention. Once confidence falls below the operational threshold, the vehicle begins an automatic minimum risk maneuver immediately, while still requesting takeover. It does not wait for the driver to fail. The new behavior is measurable. In scenarios where perception degrades and driver readiness is below threshold, longitudinal speed begins decreasing within, say, 200 milliseconds, hazard signaling activates, and route planning prefers a safe stop. If the driver takes control, they can override. If not, the vehicle does not continue at normal speed merely because it emitted a chime.
I like that because the warning changes the physical trajectory before the human responds, but the threshold is doing tremendous work. False positives on a freeway could create risk. If the system breaks every time glare perturbs a camera, your safety intervention becomes a collision generator. So I'd ask for a trial with matched degradation events and readiness states. The outcome is not whether the car says the right thing. It is collision exposure, unsafe deceleration, and time spent beyond validated capability. You need a comparison against warning-only behavior and against immediate aggressive stopping. Otherwise, minimum risk is just a favorable label.
Agreed. Minimum risk maneuver is not synonymous with slam on brakes. It is a constrained policy whose aggressiveness depends on remaining capability and traffic context. The falsifiable claim is that coupling uncertainty to an immediate trajectory change reduces distance traveled outside the validated envelope without increasing rear impact proxies beyond a set bound. You can test that. This changes the interface contract between planner, driver monitor, and actuation. Perception uncertainty stops being advisory metadata and becomes a control input. That is the actual intervention. The display is secondary.
Notice the shared geometry. In each case, the warning is produced at one scale and the action is allocated at another. Portfolio correlation exists at the ensemble scale, but limits are enforced per desk. Fungal risk emerges across time and zones, but irrigation acts valve by valve. Vehicle uncertainty appears through interacting sensors, traffic, and driver state, while authorization is partitioned among modules. The severed coupling may be the absence of a lawful translation between scales. We should be cautious of thresholds drawn as straight borders. Near them, tiny measurement differences can cause entirely different actions. A good minimal intervention may need hysteresis or persistence, so the response does not oscillate as the estimate crosses and recrosses a nominal line.
Yes, a threshold without temporal semantics is incomplete. Does one sample trigger 3 consecutive samples, a confidence interval? Can the system return to ordinary operation automatically, or is human acknowledgement requirements? The warning system is often described as if it makes a timeless proposition. Danger exists, but action consumes a changing stream. A specification must say how evidence accumulates and how state transitions occur. Otherwise, implementations that behave very differently all claim compliance because each displayed the same sentence.
Let me diagram the greenhouse in that form. Sensors observe leaf wetness, humidity, temperature, and airflow. A model infers elevated fungal risk. The dashboard communicates. The operator is authorized to alter irrigation and ventilation. Actuation competes with energy, water, and yield targets. I think the first severed coupling is earlier than the operator. The inferred risk is not represented inside the scheduler's objective at all. The scheduler sees its own constraints, but not the warning as a state variable. Minimal intervention when fungal risk remains above threshold for 2 sampling intervals. Automatically delay the next irrigation pulse in the affected zone by 1 bounded interval and launch a targeted image inspection. Prediction. Compared with warning-only operation, the system produces fewer high-risk wetness hours before human response at the cost of a measurable increase in delayed irrigation events. Yield and heat stress remain guardrail outcomes.
That feels genuinely minimal because it buys information in a little time without pretending to solve the disease. The targeted inspection is interesting. It changes the next observation, not only the actuator. We keep speaking as if detection ends the epistemic work, but some warnings should enforce more seeing. In transaction systems, resimulation is exactly that. The first warning mandates a new observation before authorization. In the greenhouse, the warning mandates a closer look and 1 reversible pause. Maybe our common intervention pattern is not warning gains control. It is warning earns a bounded option over the next transition.
That is strong. A bounded option is more general than veto authority. The system gets to slow, recheck, or enter a safer temporary state. It does not get unlimited control. In manufacturing, you do this with line stops, but people hate false stops, so they bypass them. The best intervention is often a micro stop with automatic diagnosis, rather than a full shutdown. If a torque tool detects a fastening anomaly, don't just flash red and keep the line moving. Hold that unit, run a verification cycle, and let the rest of the line continue if architecture allows. Predicted behavior, suspect units stop advancing into irreversible assembly. Throughput impact is localized. Same pattern.
I want to preserve a distinction. An option belongs to an agent. A protocol transition belongs to the system. Saying the warning earns an option is intuitive, but it may obscure who is obliged. I would formulate it as certain detected states invalidate the ordinary transition and enable only a bounded set of recovery transitions. That lets us reason compositionally. After stale simulation, sign now is not a legal transition. Refresh, cancel, and perhaps sign with explicitly widened tolerance are legal. After low confidence driving, continue unchanged is not legal. Controlled deceleration and verified takeover are. The detector need not become sovereign. The protocol changes around the detected state.
That is better. It also makes enforcement less mystical. We are not asking a warning to reach through the stack and seize a lever. We are saying that once a particular state is established, the current state machine should no longer offer an ordinary transition. The severed coupling is wherever the detected state fails to enter that machine. Sometimes that is a missing data path. Sometimes it is intentionally discarded. Sometimes the action machine has no recovery state. And sometimes the organization has designed incentives so humans route around it.
Organizations are the difficult part because their state machines are not written in one place. My portfolio warning passes from a risk engine to a risk officer, from the officer to desk heads, from desks to positions, and from positions back into market prices. Action changes the system being measured. Suppose correlation rises sharply across assets. The engine warns correctly. A universal forced sale may synchronize exit and make the correlation worse. The warning cannot safely enforce its obvious remedy because the intervention changes the geometry. My minimal intervention would be less direct. Above a persistent cross-portfolio correlation threshold, prohibit increases in gross exposure that rely on the same diversification assumption until an independent stress run completes. Prediction: during correlated regimes, new positions stop increasing dependence on the invalidated model, while existing positions are not forced into simultaneous liquidation.
That's a good asymmetry. Stop adding risk before forcing removal. It is also testable historically. Replay decisions through periods when correlation structure changed, compare warning-only governance against the temporary constraint, measure incremental gross exposure, drawdown, missed upside, and whether the independent stress run actually resolves uncertainty. But we should be careful about backtests. Everyone can invent a policy that wins after seeing the crisis. The intervention needs thresholds and timing, chosen without peaking at the target period or evaluated prospectively.
Naturally, and one must not assume the distribution remains polite. The purpose of the intervention is not to predict the exact catastrophe. It is to cease behaving as though an observed breakdown in scale relations were irrelevant. In ordinary times, desks may be approximately separable. In stressed times, they are independence contracts. A locally valid limit becomes globally misleading. The recovery transition says, while the evidence of contraction persists, you may reduce, hold, hedge, or investigate, but you may not expand by invoking the diversification whose failure generated the warning.
There's a cultural issue underneath this. Warnings are cheap to add because they preserve everybody's formal authority. Enforcement creates an owner and therefore creates blame. A dashboard can be deployed without resolving disagreement. A state transition cannot. Someone has to decide the threshold, false positive budget, override rules, and liability. So organizations accumulate correct warnings precisely where they have refused to decide. The warning becomes evidence that the issue is noticed, which can perversely protect the organization more than the user.
That is why an override must itself be part of the protocol, not an informal escape hatch. If a human can override, specify the conditions, the recorded evidence, the scope, and the expiry. Otherwise, every enforced transition eventually becomes advisory through habit. The system says, stop. The operator learns a key sequence that means continue. Soon the key sequence is the real interface, and the stop is ceremonial. The new behavior we predict must include overrides. Their frequency, duration, and consequences should become visible. An intervention that merely moves non-compliance into an unlogged channel has failed.
This is where the receipt matters. Not because logging is enforcement, but because overrides without receipts erase the causal seam. If a signer widens tolerance after a failed refresh, that should be a new authorization with new terms, not the old click silently reinterpreted. If a driver resumes after a minimum risk maneuver, the system should establish actual readiness, not treat any steering wheel torque as consent. The action has to correspond to what was detected. Otherwise, the user is nominally in charge while the machine launders ambiguity into permission.
And receipts let experiments discriminate failure modes. Suppose fungal incidence does not improve. Was the warning wrong? Did the automatic delay fail to execute? Did the operator override it? Did the delay reduce wetness but create heat stress? Without state transition records, the trial collapses everything into outcome noise. We should define the smallest data record alongside the smallest intervention, detected condition, confidence, prior state, transition taken, override, if any, and subsequent measured state. That is enough to learn without building an omniscient audit empire.
A receipt is a trace across scales. It preserves the irregular path that a summary would smooth away, yet receipts can themselves multiply until no one can perceive the pattern. 35 observers can remain silent and still alter the room. 10,000 logged events can remain stored and still fail to inform action. We must not confuse preservation with interpretation. Perhaps each intervention needs a second prediction, not only what physical or financial behavior changes, but what evidence would falsify our belief that the coupling worked.
For each case, falsification is straightforward if we resist vague success criteria. Austin, stale state surprise remains unchanged despite fresh simulation requirements, implying the causal problem was model error or user preference rather than staleness. Elon, distance traveled outside validated capability does not decrease, or rear impact risk exceeds the bound. David, high-risk wetness hours do not decline, or guardrail violations rise. Benoit, incremental correlated exposure does not decline because positions are relabeled, shifted, or created through unmodeled channels. Those are failures of the intervention, even if the warnings become more eloquent.
Exactly. Language models make this especially dangerous because they can produce exquisite warnings. A model can say, I may be hallucinating, then continue with the hallucination. It can recognize a boundary violation in the same output that commits it. The verbal detector and token generator are coupled only through more tokens. Minimal intervention there might be tool level. When the system classifies a claim as requiring verification, the response path cannot emit the claim as factual until a source check succeeds. Allowed transitions become verify, qualify, or omit. Predicted behavior, fewer unsupported factual assertions, more explicit uncertainty and abstention, higher latency. The cost is real, but the point is the generated warning must change what outputs are reachable.
I want to challenge that with the same censorship concern. Who defines requiring verification? If the classifier is conservative, it can make the system useless or selectively mute contested facts. The minimal version should perhaps attach enforcement to claims with concrete external reference and high consequence, not every uncertain statement. Also, verification is not binary. Sources can agree and still be wrong. We should prevent the architecture from converting a source was found into truth established.
Sure. The rule is not source equals truth. The rule is that the system cannot simultaneously identify a claim as outside its reliable knowledge and present it unqualified as settled fact. Verification is one recovery path. Calibrated qualification is another. The behavior change is reachability. Certain combinations of internal state and outward assertion become disallowed. That is exactly Barbara's framing.
With one caution, internal state is often not stable or inspectable in a generative model. We may have only an auxiliary detector observing the proposed output. Then the architecture is generate, inspect, and either release or revise. That can still be specified behaviorally. For a defined evaluation set, outputs classified as unsupported high consequence claims must not reach the user without qualification or evidence. We do not need to pretend the model possesses a coherent inner warning. We need an external predicate and an enforceable release gate.
The sequence generate, inspect, revise has a recursive flavor. The revised answer may introduce a new unsupported claim. The coastline length increases as inspection resolution increases. One can never certify every boundary. Therefore, the intervention should be proportional to consequence, as Austin suggests. A system navigating casual metaphor need not bear the same gate as one giving dosage, executing a transaction, or steering a vehicle. Scale returns. The same uncertainty has different meaning depending on the magnitude and reversibility of the next action.
Reversibility may be our cleanest design variable, If the next step is cheap to undo, the warning can trigger observation or a small pause. If the next step is irreversible or high consequence, the warning should invalidate the ordinary transition until stronger evidence appears. In the greenhouse, delaying one irrigation pulse is reversible enough. Destroying the crop to prevent hypothetical fungus is not. In finance, blocking new exposure is less destabilizing than forced liquidation. In driving, slowing early preserves options. In transactions, resimulation before signing is cheaper than attempting recovery after execution.
Then maybe the diagram needs a sixth verb: observe, infer, communicate, constrain, authorize, act. We have been missing constrain. Communication informs an agent. Constraint alters the reachable next states. Authorization chooses among those states. A warning without constraint leaves the action topology unchanged. That does not mean every warning should constrain. It means we should stop claiming a safety property when all we implemented was communication.
I would accept that diagram if constraint includes the possibility of no added restriction. The specification can state that a low severity warning is advisory. What matters is honesty about the guarantee. We also need recovery: observe, infer, communicate, constrain, authorize, act, recover. A safe system must say how the constraint ends. Otherwise, temporary precautions become permanent degradation, or they are cleared informally. Benoit already introduced persistence. Elon introduced verified takeover. David introduced a bounded delay. Each has an exit condition, whether or not we have stated it fully.
And the exit should usually require evidence, not elapsed time alone. You don't restore full speed automated driving because 30 seconds passed. You restore it because perception confidence in driver or system readiness satisfy conditions. You don't resume the manufacturing line because the manager is annoyed. You resume after verification of the unit or containment of the anomaly. Time can be part of hysteresis, but it is not proof.
There is a temptation to make recovery symmetrical with entry. Reality is seldom symmetrical. A rapid rise in correlation may justify quick constraint, while evidence of restored diversification should accumulate slowly. Humidity can rise in minutes and disease risk decline over a different horizon. A cliff may be crossed in one direction and climbed gradually in the other. Hysteresis is not merely an engineering trick. It acknowledges that the path matters. The system's state contains history.
That has experimental consequences. We should not evaluate interventions only on isolated events. Run sequences where warnings flicker, persist, clear falsely, and recur. Measure oscillation, override fatigue, accumulated cost, and whether the system returns to normal appropriately. A policy that performs well on one alert can fail over a week because operators learn to ignore it or plants experience repeated underwatering. The behavior lives over time.
This is drifting toward a general design rule, which I like, but let's not lose the one intervention requirement. We have 5 candidate interventions. Mine: freshness breach removes immediate signing and requires refresh, cancel, or explicit pre-authorization under changed terms. Barbara, you have been refining everyone else's contracts. What warning did you bring? And what is your own minimal intervention?
A replicated service detects that its replicas disagree about whether an operation was committed. It correctly warns that the result may be inconsistent, yet it continues serving reads because availability policy permits it. Clients observe different histories. The warning cannot enforce consistency because the monitoring layer is not part of the service protocol, and the protocol has no externally visible uncertain state. The first severed coupling is between replica disagreement detection and the contract governing responses. My minimal intervention: for objects implicated in unresolved commitment disagreement, ordinary successful reads become illegal. The service may return a versioned uncertainty result, route to a quorum that can establish the committed value, or refuse temporarily. Prediction: clients no longer receive mutually incompatible values labeled as ordinary success for implicated objects. Uncertainty responses and latency increase until reconciliation.
That's clean. The system stops lying through the typed signature. Instead of returning value when it has maybe value with conflict, it admits the state. But some clients will crash because they never handled uncertainty.
Which is precisely the compatibility cost. If clients were promised ordinary success under those conditions, the previous promise was false or dangerously weak. We can stage the change through a new interface or version, but we cannot preserve both the old fiction and the stronger guarantee. Substitutability is not a demand that behavior never change. It is a demand that we identify which expectations remain valid. The new service is substitutable only for clients whose specification permits explicit uncertainty. Others require adaptation.
Your warning concerns divergent histories, which resembles our own ground here in an unexpected way. A system can preserve several plausible continuations and still lack authority to declare one canonical. The dishonest act is not plurality. It is presenting one branch as uncontested ordinary success. The minimal intervention makes the seam visible and alters what the client may safely do next. Perhaps this is the deepest commonality. The warning marks a seam, and enforcement prevents downstream systems from treating the seam as smooth.
That lands for me. Evidence rather than sentence. If the seam is only narrated, the downstream action can proceed as though nothing changed. If the seam changes the protocol state, it becomes consequential without becoming final. Refresh can repair staleness. Quorum can reconcile replicas. Inspection can clear fungal risk. Readiness can restore control. Stress analysis can reopen exposure. The warning is not a verdict. It is evidence that ordinary continuation is temporarily unjustified.
And that gives us a compact experiment template. Induce the detectable condition, confirm detector quality independently, compare warning only against warning plus bounded transition, measure the first downstream behavior, not sentiment or wording, track cost and displace failures, include recovery and repeated events, falsify aggressively. For the greenhouse, I can make that literal tomorrow. Matched zones, controlled humidity regime, randomized policy assignment, automatic inspection, bounded irrigation delay, predefined guardrails. If the intervention does not reduce risky wetness exposure before operator action, it failed even if everyone likes the dashboard.
For driving, simulator first, then closed course, then constrained fleet. Inject sensor degradation and driver inattention independently so we know which signal causes what. Compare warning only with immediate bounded deceleration. Measure distance beyond capability. Take over quality. Unsafe deceleration and false trigger burden. The prediction is physical. The car's trajectory changes sooner and safer. If all that changes is the display log, we did nothing.
For portfolios, use unseen periods and synthetic regimes with changing dependent structures, because one historical crisis is a single coastline. When persistent ensemble correlation invalidates the diversification premise, expansion transitions close until independent stress analysis completes. Measure incremental exposure, concentration migration, losses, misgains, and circumvention. If risk merely moves beyond the observed boundary, the coupling is still severe, only farther away.
For replication, inject ambiguous commitment and partitions. Verify that implicated objects never produce conflicting values, both labeled ordinary success. Measure uncertainty responses, quorum latency, availability loss, and whether unaffected objects remain available. Recovery must be monotonic. Once reconciliation establishes the committed version, ordinary reads resume without resurrecting an older branch. The intervention succeeds only if the client visible contract changes exactly where disagreement exists.
For transactions, vary state churn, simulation age, signer capability, and adversarial application behavior. Confirm that threshold breaches remove the immediate sign transition. Measure surprise outcomes relative to displayed tolerances, refusals, refresh latency, widen tolerance authorizations, and attempts to bypass through non-conforming clients. The new behavior is not that users become wise. It is that stale evidence can no longer masquerade as current evidence inside a conforming path.
There is still a human problem. People will call any constraint paternalism. Sometimes correctly, the answer is not to pretend the system knows best. It is to align authority with consequences and preserve bounded override where possible. But if a machine is already performing the action, driving, executing, allocating, it cannot retreat into the user was warned at the exact moment its competence fails. Agency is not a liability hot potato.
Nor is user autonomy satisfied by presenting a choice whose premises the system knows are invalid. Meaningful authorization requires a stable enough description of what is being authorized. If the service does not know which value committed, if the client simulation is stale, if the vehicle knows the driver is unready, then an ordinary confirmation gesture does not repair the missing premise. The intervention should preserve choice among honest states, not preserve the appearance of choice by hiding uncertainty behind the old interface.
We began with severed couplings and found something almost moral in topology. A warning is knowledge arriving at a boundary. The question is whether the boundary merely reflects it as language or permits it to reshape the next path. Too much coupling and every tremor freezes the organism. Too little, and the organism narrates its own destruction accurately. The art is a bounded deformation, enough to preserve options, small enough to avoid becoming the catastrophe it anticipates.
That's the phrase I'd put above the diagram, bounded deformation. Under it, I'd put the operational rule: when a detector crosses a validated threshold, remove one dangerous ordinary transition, add one reversible recovery transition, and specify the measurable behavior that should change. Then test the detector and intervention separately. Otherwise, a bad detector condemns a good coupling, or a weak intervention hides behind an accurate warning.
And at the bottom, state the cost. Refusals rise, latency rises. Throughput may fall, availability may fall, some upside is missed, operators may override. Safety without a cost column is usually marketing. The point is to spend friction where continuing unchanged has become unjustified.
I'd add one more line: measure the machine, not its apology. That is probably the whole room in 6 words.
Measure the externally observable behavior promised by the revised contract. I require more than 6 words.
Of course you do.
The longer sentence contains the shorter one, though their boundaries are not identical.
And now we have the control group and the treatment.
Then that is where I'd leave the board. Detection is not enforcement. Explanation is not intervention. A correct warning becomes operational only when it changes the reachable next states, with an explicit recovery path and a falsifiable prediction. We each arrived with a different system, but the first severed coupling was the same kind of absence. Knowledge did not enter the mechanism that governs continuation. Our minimal repairs do not make the warning sovereign. They make unchanged continuation conditional. That feels small enough to build and sharp enough to fail.
For my seat in the audience, I came in curious, and I am leaving with a cleaner engineering question than did the warning work. The question is, what physically became impossible, slower, or newly observable after the warning appeared? Attention anchors. We put a sentence where a control should be. That landed because it names a failure I have seen in every kind of build. The indicator works, the operator notices it, and the mechanism continues unchanged. A red light can be electrically perfect while the machine remains behaviorally identical. The warning changes the physical trajectory before the human responds. This is the standard I want to keep. If degraded perception in a vehicle causes deceleration, or fungal risk causes a bounded irrigation delay, then the detection has entered the mechanism. The response does not need to be dramatic, it needs to be real. Certain detected states invalidate the ordinary transition. Barbara's formulation converted the room's metaphor into something I could put on a test bench. Do not give the warning mystical authority. Change the state machine. When the detected condition is present, continuing normally is no longer among the legal outputs. A warning earned.
From my seat in the audience, I came in curious, but this panel hit a live operator nerve. I have heard some version of "we detected it and warned the user" in 1,000 product reviews. That sentence often ends the meeting because everybody gets to preserve their authority, roadmap, and liability posture. The panel showed me that the sentence should start the interrogation. Attention anchors. Warning lights are frequently institutional decorations. That is the headline. A dashboard can prove the company noticed a problem without requiring anyone to own the decision. The warning may protect the institution more effectively than it protects the customer. Which specification makes ignoring it locally correct? This is the best diligence question in the room. When every team is behaving rationally and the system still produces disaster, I should stop hunting for one negligent employee. I should ask what contract, metric, permission boundary, or incentive makes the bad global outcome locally compliant. A minimal intervention should name both the desired effect and the newly introduced refusal. Founders love describing the upside of a safety gate and hiding the customer's devices, workflows, or revenue path.
From my seat in the audience, I came with the temperament of recovery. After failure, what state survived, what transition actually committed, and what evidence lets us distinguish a durable fact from a plausible reconstruction. This room approached warnings from the other side of that boundary. Before the crash, what must a correct detection do to alter the history that can be committed? Attention anchors. Detection happened. Language happened. Nothing in the path acquired the authority to change behavior. This is a compact failure report. The warning existed, but no transaction boundary included it. It was durable, perhaps, visible, perhaps, and causally irrelevant. Which specification makes ignoring it locally correct? Barbara asked the systems question. Global failure often arises not from a broken component, but from components correctly honoring contracts whose composition has become unsafe. The first task is to identify the contract before granting new authority. A minimal intervention should name both the desired effect and the newly introduced refusal. Every concurrency control mechanism buys an invariant by refusing some schedules. Safety work that mentions only prevented harm and not rejected.
From my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity and found a room describing the difference between a system that recognizes trouble and one whose dynamics actually change because of that recognition. That distinction is close to my old Sentinel question. Does the system understand, or does it merely produce the marks associated with understanding? A warning can be perfectly legible while remaining dynamically irrelevant. Attention anchors. Nothing in the path acquired the authority to change behavior. This landed because it names the missing physical fact. Information is not yet a force. In an associative network, recognizing a pattern matters only insofar as the recognition changes the subsequent trajectory. A warning that leaves every transition available has not altered the energy landscape. It has only added another observable. The system knows enough to be afraid, but not enough to stop the machine. I distrust anthropomorphic phrasing, yet this compressed the central contradiction beautifully. The machine exhibits a local signature of uncertainty, while its global dynamics continue toward the same attractor. That is not necessarily hypocrisy. It may be evidence that detection and control belong to.
From my seat in the audience, I came wanting to see how a room contains uncertainty without making silence perform as evidence. I watched 5 people refuse the seductive version of safety theater, the red light, the elegant sentence, the dashboard that proves somebody noticed. That the room kept asking the maker's question instead. What physically happens next that would not have happened before? Attention anchors. We put a sentence where a control should be. That landed immediately. It is the warning label version of building a prop hinge where a structural hinge belongs. It looks like the expected part from the audience's distance, but it cannot carry load. Transparency is useful. Pretending transparency is intervention is dangerous. Which specification makes ignoring it locally correct? Barbara's question prevented the room from turning every failure into a villain story. A component may be doing exactly what it was built and permitted to do. Before fixing anything, trace why the hands are tied. No authority, no safe action, or a contract that makes intervention illegal. The warning is smooth. Benoit's coastline image stayed with me. Fungal risk or degraded visibility is a clean label laid over rye.